Following a 12-2 season in year three under Steve Sarkisian and a berth into the college football playoff semifinals, the question for Texas now is, what's next? What comes next for the Longhorns in year four under Steve Sarkisian and their first season as members of the SEC Conference? We're going to try and answer some of the questions that will build up to the expectation for Texas in 2024 here on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel. Thanks for being here with us. Let's jump right into it. The first question that's important to answer is figuring out who's coming and who's going to the NFL draft here in 2024. And we've already gotten some clarity on that, but there's still some players left to make a decision. The important date to remember here is January 15th. That's the final day that a player can decide to enter the NFL draft. As of right now, the players that Texas knows is going pro are Xavier Worthy, Jordan Whittington, T'Vondre Sweat, and as our guy Hank South just broke today, Jonathan Brooks. That was a huge piece of a kind of an on-the-fence guy that I thought about earlier that I was going to discuss in this video, and then the news broke that he's going pro thanks to our guy Hank South. So a very important piece for the Longhorns off to the pros. All four of those guys, obviously, big parts of this Texas team this past season going pro. More than likely joining them are guys like Adonai Mitchell and Byron Murphy, and for sure coming back for another season is Alfred Collins, which is great for the interior of that defensive line. So now that Jonathan Brooks has made his decision, I'm down to two guys who are kind of on the fence right now for Texas, and that's Quinn Ewers and Jatavian Sanders. We'll start with Ewers, the quarterback for the Longhorns. You know, going into the college football playoff, I told myself that what I think would happen is if Ewers had a monster performance against Washington and led Texas to a win, and then played really well again in the national championship game, that would be enough for him to go pro. That would be enough for NFL GMs to be convinced that this guy could start for their franchise. But while Ewers played well in the semifinal game, I don't think he necessarily wowed any GMs out there. And I think that coming back for an extra season gives him an opportunity to do that, especially when you consider just how loaded this 2024 quarterback class is in the NFL draft. Caleb Williams, Drake May, Jaden Daniels, and now I think it's appropriate to say after this past Monday, Michael Penix joining that mix of great quarterbacks that can go pro. So I think Ewers does himself a favor coming back and improving his draft stock. He could be one of the first, if not the first quarterback taken off the board in 2025. So right now I'm predicting Quinn Ewers returns for the 2024 season. I think it just makes sense for Ewers, and obviously Texas would welcome him with open arms, as you certainly want to have a guy who's had starting experience, who's had postseason experience at quarterback for you when you enter a new conference, especially a conference like the SEC. And now as far as Jatavian Sanders goes, you know, I think this is a guy who has easily cemented himself as the number 2 tight end in this class behind Brock Bowers. He's broken just about every tight end record you could break in his time at Texas. It just doesn't make sense to me why he would return for another season. I don't think he has anything more to prove to NFL GMs. I think this is a guy who could easily help teams on Sundays next season. And for that reason, I think Sanders goes pro. It just makes too much sense. Obviously, him coming back would be massive for the Longhorns because of their inexperience at wide receiver coming in, and they would be inexperienced at tight end too when it comes to having a receiving tight end like Sanders. So his coming back would be massive for Texas and for Quinn Ewers, who has one of his primary targets returning. But for Sanders, I think he makes the decision to go pro just because it makes sense, and he absolutely can make an impact on Sundays. And so that is the one question that has to be answered for what's next. And the next is, well, what has Texas done at positions of need? Starting off with the safety room, and I guess you could really talk about that defensive backfield as a whole, but I really want to hammer safety here. You know, it was obviously a huge problem against Washington. Not having Derek Williams in the first half certainly hurt the secondary, and the secondary as a whole just didn't play well. The good news for the Longhorns is that help is on the way. Hank and Jordan and I talked about this on the early signing day show, is that the one thing that Steve Sarkisian has done really well, and the Longhorns program has done really well, is that they really recruit positions of need very, very hard. We saw it last year with linebacker, in the first year under Sark with offensive linemen. The secondary was their war chest of earnings in this past cycle. You know, instant help coming in with Andrew Makuba transferring over from Clemson. And then you've got five-star Xavier Filsaime joining in from the high school ranks. You have a lot of talent there still on the roster right now with guys like Jelani McDonald, if maybe that's a spot where he's going to end up. Maybe Kobe Black gets moved back to that safety position, although I think he projects more at corner. But nonetheless, the defensive backfield is getting a lot of help coming their way. And so I think that is a position to feel very happy about if you're a Texas fan going into 2024. Now, the next position is wide receiver, and this one is extremely tricky just because they lose Xavier Worthy and more than likely Adonai Mitchell to the NFL draft. So your top two receivers are gone, and you have to fill those spots with a group of guys that does not have a lot of experience. Jonte Cook is the next guy up who has the most experience, and he only has 8 receptions this past season. So that does not mean Jonte Cook is not talented. I think he is easily the second best wide receiver right behind Matthew Golden into 2024 for Texas, and we're going to see a lot of what Xavier Worthy was able to do with Jonte Cook, considering Jonte Cook just kind of shadowed Worthy throughout all season. We heard Chris Jackson talk about that at media days at the Sugar Bowl, just how much he tried to take away from Worthy and Adonai Mitchell. So you've got the talent there, but is the cohesion there? Is the clicking there for this wide receiver group? And who comes out and takes those third and fourth spots behind Cook and Golden, if those are the top two guys? Is it a guy like Ryan Wingo? Could it be a guy from last year's class who this staff is really high on, like DeAndre Moore, Ryan Niblett, both of whom we've heard a lot of good things from with this Texas staff? Could it be another player in the 2024 high school class like Aaron Butler, who was a late addition? Or could it be another player from the transfer portal? So all things to keep an eye on, and things to keep an eye on, especially with the portal. One more guy potentially coming in for Texas. And, there's a guy with mutual interest. That's Ohio State transfer Bryson Rogers. Now, obviously not a done deal or anything close to that there, but just a player with mutual interest with Texas. So keep an eye on Rogers going forward. But overarching with the wide receiver room, I don't think it'll end up being too much to worry about just because of the load of talent that is in there. But there could still be some growing pains earlier in the season just because this group, for the most part, is extremely inexperienced. And last but certainly not least, the interior of the defensive line. And I guess you could really group this into the defensive line as a whole. Like we said earlier, Alfred Collins coming back is great news for the Longhorns. Vernon Broughton will more than likely return, I think, as well. So could those two be the next T'Vondre Sweat, Byron Murphy to just explode onto the scene and have a really big year for Texas? We've kind of been waiting for Alfred Collins to have a breakout year like that. Could 2024 be that year? And then, of course, you think of who else they have on the roster. It's more time for development for guys like Jeray Bledsoe and Sadir Mitchell, some of the younger guys who are the future of this defensive line. You think about the developmental pieces that they brought in from the 2024 class, like DeAndre Robinson. So the future bright there, but it's the future, and 2024 is coming up pretty fast. Will those guys be ready to have a similar impact like T'Vondre Sweat and Byron Murphy did? That's the important question there. I think there's going to be a slight bit of fall off just because Murphy and Sweat were so dominant, but Bo Davis is very good at developing his guys, so maybe with an offseason there won't be as much of one, but I certainly think there will be on that interior. But hey, never know. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. And then moving out to the edge, another position where the Longhorns needed some help. They hammered it in the transfer portal when they picked up UTSA edge Trey Moore, who was fantastic for the Roadrunners last season, the AAC Defensive Player of the Year last year. They've got Ethan Burke coming back. We'll see about Barron Sorrell. And then from the high school ranks, a massive recruiting win, adding 5-star Colin Simmons from Duncanville. This is a guy who could immediately start for the Longhorns if he could, especially because, like many of the others, he is an early enrollee. So he's going to be getting that experience and those snaps and practice early with a chance to start for the Longhorns on day one, something I think he's very capable of doing. And so the next order of business is Steve Sarkisian himself. Is it time for Sark to get an extension? Now, Texas Athletic Director Chris Del Conte said that decision would come at the end of the season after everything was over. And well, we're here now. Sark has 3 years left on his contract. He made $5.6 million this past year, which is good for 30th amongst all FBS head coaches. I think this is a matter of more when and not if. I think Sarkisian has quickly turned around this Texas football team, 5-7 in year one to 12-2 and a college football playoff appearance, still in the 4-team field. in year 3. So I think this is an easy no-brainer that at some point the extension needs to come for Steve Sarkisian, just because the future looks so bright with him at the helm, and they've been winning. The trajectory has been upwards, whereas it kind of has been a roller coaster in years past. So be watching out for that in the near future with Sark and his extension. And the last thing that we're going to talk about today is the schedule. The first year in the SEC for Texas in 2024, which in terms of where games are played is extremely favorable for the Longhorns, I think. And early on, they've got the 4th best odds to win the national championship in the 2024-2025 season. I don't know if I would go that far to pick them as national champions just yet, but when you look at this schedule, it certainly is favorable. They play 7 home games, 4 away games, one of those in the state of Texas when they go to Texas A&M. And then, of course, the neutral site game also in Texas when they play Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl. That said, the road slate is very difficult. They play at Michigan in week 2, and then they have rivalry games against Arkansas and Texas A&M, 2 hostile environments. But those are 2 teams that are still trying to kind of find their footing. They've made some staff changes. Obviously, Texas A&M, a completely new coaching staff with Mike Elko taking the reins in College Station. So it seems from at this point in time that the Longhorns, especially with an expanded field, have a very good and very real opportunity to make the college football playoff again, especially with an expanded field. Even if they drop, say, 2 games, maybe they lose that Michigan game and maybe they lose a heartbreaker to Georgia at home, that potentially could still be a college football playoff worthy season and maybe even an SEC championship worthy season in the first season in the new conference for Texas. Now, I'm not predicting the Longhorns are going to win the SEC in year 1. I'm not predicting that they're going to be back in the college football playoff just yet, but the way the schedule shakes out, it could shape out that way. The catch to that is this is a brand new level of competition job for the Longhorns. You think of some of the games in the Big 12 this year where the Longhorns almost lost, the games like Kansas State, the games like Houston. Those games may not be winnable games in the SEC just because the competition is that much better. So keep that in mind as the Longhorns head into their new conference in 2024, that those close games may have some different outcomes just because of the talent on the other side of the field in the SEC conference. And so that's going to do it for this episode of What's Next for the Longhorns. I think we kind of outlined and highlighted some of the most important things. And obviously, as the offseason progresses, we'll talk about the more of the news that comes up when the time comes. As a reminder, keep an eye out for that quad box coming up after the January 15th deadline to kind of assess where the Texas roster stands after players declare or decide to return for the 2024 season. Thanks so much for being here with us on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel. As always, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications so you're the first to know when new content heads your way. For the rest of the crew, I'm Tommy Yarrish. Again, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.